She slammed the contract onto the table so hard the wine glasses shook. "Sign it," Elena Vasquez said, leaning across the white linen toward Lillian with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Or I'll make sure every person in this restaurant knows exactly what kind of trash Damien dragged off the floor and put a ring on." Lillian's hand tightened around her water glass. Around them, 40 people in designer clothes pretended not to watch. Some of them were already smiling. This was supposed to be a welcome dinner. That contract, 3 pages demanding Lillian surrender any claim to Damien's assets in exchange for social acceptance from the wives of Chicago's most powerful crime families, was Elena's idea of a greeting. Lillian looked at the paper. Then she looked at Elena. And she did something nobody in that room expected. She smiled back. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought your silence meant weakness, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what Lillian does next will change everything you think you know about quiet people. And if this is your first time here, subscribe now and hit that bell. I don't want you to miss a single story. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The night everything changed for Lillian Brooks began. Not with a gunshot or a car chase or any of the dramatic entrances people associate with the Chicago underworld. It began with a broken coffee carafe, a private dining room on the 43rd floor of the Meridian Hotel, and a conversation she was never supposed to hear. She had worked the private events floor at Meridian for 6 years. 6 years of memorizing dietary restrictions, managing the moods of men who treated every meal like a performance, and smiling through comments that would have made a younger woman cry. Lillian was 31 years old. She was not young enough to be naive and not old enough to stop caring. That particular combination had kept her invisible in the best possible way, competent, forgettable, and trusted with rooms where the real Chicago did its real business. The night of October 14th, she was alone in the service corridor behind Private Room 7 when the carafe handle cracked in her grip. Hot coffee spread across the sleeve of her uniform. She grabbed a clean towel from the service cart, blotted the damage, checked the time. 12 minutes before she was due inside to clear the appetizer course. She needed a replacement carafe from the kitchen 2 floors down. That was the moment the door to room 7 swung open and a man in a gray suit stepped halfway into the corridor to take a phone call. Lillian pressed herself flat against the wall behind the cart. Not hiding exactly, just staying out of the way experienced service staff learned to do. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was standing still, holding a wet towel, waiting for the man to go back inside so she could slip past without interrupting. But the man in the gray suit wasn't being quiet about his phone call. The accounts in the Cayman structure, the ones under Fortuna Holdings, all of it. Move it before Thursday. Once Moretti signs the Lakeshore contracts, the money's traceable and we're finished. A pause. He trusts me. That's why it works. He doesn't look at what he doesn't think he needs to look at. Another pause. Sal, I don't care. Make the transfers and stop calling this number. The man stepped back inside. The door clicked shut. Lillian stood there for a moment with the wet towel in her hand. She was not an accountant. She did not know the specifics of Fortuna Holdings or the Lakeshore contracts. But she had grown up with a father who taught her that the most dangerous sentence in the English language was, "He trusts me," spoken by someone who was actively betraying that trust. She got a new carafe. She went back in. She did her job. And for the next 4 hours, while she cleared plates and refilled glasses and moved around the edges of Private Room 7, like she was part of the furniture, she watched the man in the gray suit, whose name, she eventually gathered from the conversation, was Marcus Trent, sit directly to the right of Damien Moretti and laugh at his jokes and touch his shoulder and call him boss with an ease that made her stomach hurt. Damien Moretti. She had heard the name the way everyone in Chicago had heard it, quietly, seriously, and always with the understanding that you didn't discuss it loudly. He was not a politician or a television personality. He was not famous in any way that involved cameras or publicists. He was famous in the way that certain buildings become famous, not because of anything written about them, but because of the way people's voices dropped slightly when they mentioned them. He was younger than she expected. Maybe 40, 42. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A face that was not handsome in any conventional way, but was the kind of face that made it difficult to look away from. Too still, too controlled, like every expression on it had been deliberately chosen. He held his fork correctly and his glass correctly, and he said very little during the meal. But everything he said landed with weight. Lillian served him his main course, and he said, "Thank you." And she said, "Of course, sir." And that was the full extent of their interaction. She did not plan what happened next. She did not rehearse it or calculate it. She simply, at the end of her shift, after the room had cleared and she was doing her final pass with the floor cart, found Marcus Trent's business card on the floor under the chair where he'd been sitting. And she held it in her hand and thought about what she'd heard in the corridor. And then she did something that every sensible instinct she had told her was reckless. She went to the front desk of the Meridian and asked which room Mr. Moretti was staying in. The woman at the desk stared at her. "I found something that belongs to his party," Lillian said, which was true. The woman picked up the phone. 2 minutes later, a very large man in a dark jacket appeared and looked at Lillian the way people look at something they're trying to decide whether to throw away. "What do you need?" "I need 5 minutes with Mr. Moretti," Lillian said. "I heard something tonight that he should know about. I'm not selling anything, and I'm not asking for anything. I just think he should know." The large man studied her. A woman in a coffee-stained uniform holding a stranger's business card in a hotel lobby. Not a threat by any visible measurement. "Wait here," he said. She waited 22 minutes. She almost left 4 times. The only reason she didn't was that she kept thinking about Marcus Trent's voice in the corridor. "He trusts me." And the particular quality of satisfaction in it. The pleasure of someone who believed they were untouchable. She had known people like that. Her father had taught her what they eventually ran into. The large man came back. "Come with me." The suite on the 47th floor was not what she expected, which was to say it was not what television had taught her to expect. No artwork on the walls. No excess. 2 men she didn't recognize sat near the window with the posture of people who were always working. Damien Moretti stood near the wet bar with a glass of water. Not scotch, not wine, water, and looked at her the same way he'd looked at everything during dinner, carefully, without performance. "You're the waitress," he said. It wasn't unkind. It was just accurate. "Yes, sir." "Sal says you heard something." "In the service corridor, before the dinner." She told him exactly what she'd heard, word for word, the way her father had taught her to report things. No editorializing, no interpretation, just what was said. She gave him the business card. She told him which account names she remembered, because she had a good memory for words even when she didn't understand them. When she finished, the room was quiet. Damien set down his water glass. He looked at her for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" It was the question she'd been asking herself for the last 2 hours. "Because he said you trusted him," she said finally, and the way he said it made it sound like a weapon. Another silence, longer this time. "What's your name?" "Lillian Brooks." "Lillian." He said it once, like he was testing the weight of it. "Are you afraid of me?" She considered lying. She considered the diplomatic middle ground. She went with the truth because she was tired and her arms still smelled like coffee, and she was past the point of managing impressions. "A little bit, but not as afraid as I'd be of myself if I hadn't said anything." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite. But something that had been closed opened a fraction. "Thank you, Lillian Brooks," he said. "Go home." She went home. She did not sleep. She spent the night half convinced she'd made an enormous mistake, and the other half thinking about her father's voice saying, "The only thing worse than danger is knowing about danger and doing nothing." She went back to work 3 days later like nothing had happened. A week passed. Then 2. Marcus Trent did not appear for any more private dinners. She did not ask questions. On a Tuesday morning in November, 6 weeks after the dinner in room 7, Lillian arrived at the Meridian for her afternoon shift and was told by her manager, with an expression of complete bafflement, that she had a visitor waiting in the lobby. It was the large man from before. He handed her an envelope and stood there while she opened it. Inside was a card, simple, cream, with nothing printed on it, and a handwritten note that said, "I owe you a debt. Name what you need," and a number. Lillian stood in the lobby of the Meridian Hotel holding an envelope from Damien Moretti and thought, honestly and without any romance about it, that she needed to pay off her father's medical bills and that her car was making a sound that the mechanic had described as, "Not good, ma'am. Not good at all." She did not call the number that day, or the next day. She called it 8 days later because she had spent those 8 days trying to figure out how to solve both problems through legitimate means and had come to the honest conclusion that she could not. Her father had been sick for 2 years. The debt was real. The car was dying. She was 31 years old, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. The number rang twice. "I need some help," she said, "with a few things, if that's what the note meant." "It's what the note meant." Damien's voice was the same as it had been in the suite, measured, unhurried. "Come to dinner." She meant to say that dinner wasn't necessary. She meant to say they could handle it some other way. But the word dinner wasn't a question, and something in the way he said it, not commanding, just certain, made her say, "When?" "Thursday." The restaurant he chose was not the kind of place Lillian had ever eaten in as a customer. She had served in places like it. She knew how the linens felt and how the lighting was calibrated to make everyone look more attractive than they were. She arrived in the nicest dress she owned, which she was aware was not particularly nice by the standards of the room, and she found Damien Moretti already seated, already waiting, with the same economy of movement she remembered. They talked for 2 hours. Not about Marcus Trent, not about money, about her father, a decorated Army Ranger who'd come home from 3 deployments quieter than he'd left, and had spent the next 15 years teaching his daughter every useful thing he knew, including several things that most fathers do not think to teach their daughters. About her years at the Meridian, about why she'd stayed in Chicago when she'd had chances to leave, about what she thought mattered. Damien Moretti listened the way very few people listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually absorbing what she said, turning it over, responding to what she actually meant instead of what she'd said. It unnerved her slightly. She was used to being invisible. Being seen with that much focus was a different kind of exposure. "You're not what I expected," he said at one point. "What did you expect?" "Someone who wanted something bigger." "The things I want aren't small," she said. "They're just not flashy." He looked at her for a moment. "No, they're not." He handled her father's medical situation. He handled the car. He did it quickly, and without making her feel like she was being paid for something, which was something she had worried about in the 8 days before she called. He was precise about it. A debt acknowledged, a debt addressed, transaction complete. Except it wasn't complete. Because he called again the following week. Not to handle anything, just to talk. And she answered. She told herself it was because he was interesting. He was. She told herself it was gratitude. It was partly that too. But the honest truth, the one she admitted only to herself lying awake at 3 in the morning while the November wind came off the lake, was that she had never in her adult life had a conversation with anyone who made her feel like what she said genuinely mattered. She was aware of what he was. She did not pretend otherwise. Her father would have had opinions. She was also aware of what she had been before the night of October 14th, a woman who had been quietly disappearing into the furniture of other people's lives for 6 years, serving them and clearing after them and going home to a small apartment and a father who needed more help than she could comfortably provide. Danger was not abstract to her. Her father had taught her about danger the way other fathers taught their daughters about cooking, practically, seriously, with the understanding that knowing how to handle it was the difference between surviving it and not. She did not fall in love with Damien Moretti in November. She was not a woman who fell into things. What happened was slower and more complicated than that, and it happened in the wrong direction. She understood him before she felt anything for him, which made the feeling, when it came, harder to dismiss. He proposed in January, and she understood immediately that the proposal was not conventional in any sense. It was not romantic. It was direct and honest in a way that she had come to recognize as his particular language. He told her what he wanted, why he wanted it, and what it would mean for her if she said yes. He did not pretend it was simple. She thought about it for 4 days. She called her father, who had spent 15 years in a world that operated by different rules than the one most people acknowledged, listened to everything she said without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Is he honest with you?" he asked. "As far as I can tell?" "Does he underestimate you?" "No," she said, and realized as she said it that it was the first time she'd said that about anyone. "Then be careful," her father said, "but don't be scared." She said yes to Damien Moretti on a Wednesday afternoon in January, standing in her small apartment in the coat she'd worn to the Meridian 6 years running, without any performance or ceremony. He accepted it the same way. The wedding was small by the standards of what he was, which still meant 50 people she didn't know in a venue she'd never been inside. She wore a dress that had been selected for her by someone whose entire job was selecting dresses, and it was beautiful in a way that felt slightly like wearing someone else's personality. The photographs were good. She looked like the right kind of woman in them. The wives of his associates smiled at her with the precise temperature of people who had already made their decisions about her and were simply waiting for events to confirm them. She smiled back. She remembered her father's voice. She ate her dinner and drank her champagne and thought about the long game, which was the only game her father had ever considered worth playing. What she could not have known, what no one outside a very specific circle of men knew, was that the moment she became Damian Moretti's wife, she had also become the most valuable target in the Chicago underworld. Not because of anything she'd done, because of everything she hadn't done yet. And in a room across the city that same night, 3 men were already discussing the most efficient way to remove her from the equation before she became inconvenient. She was a waitress from a small apartment on the north side. She was 31 years old. She had no title, no fortune of her own, no history in any of the circles that mattered. She was, by every calculation those men made, the easiest problem they had ever been asked to solve. They had never met her father. The morning after the wedding, Lillian woke up in a bed the size of her entire former living room and lay there for a full minute just listening to the silence. Not peaceful silence, the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that comes from thick walls and security glass, and the particular hush of a house where people are always listening for something wrong. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment where the neighbors' arguments came through the walls like they were happening in the same room. This silence was its own language, and she didn't speak it yet. Damian was already gone. There was coffee on the nightstand, still hot, which meant someone had come into the room while she slept. She sat up and looked at the door and thought about that for a moment. The casual intimacy of staff who moved through private spaces like air, and made a note to herself that this was going to be an adjustment. She drank the coffee. She got dressed in the clothes she'd packed herself, which were not the clothes of a woman who had just married into serious money, and she went downstairs to find her new life. The house, Damian's primary residence, a 4-story limestone building in Lincoln Park that had been in his family since the 80s, was staffed by people who were extremely good at being professionally pleasant while revealing nothing. The housekeeper, a compact woman named Rosa, who had been there for 11 years, showed Lillian around with the thoroughness of someone giving a tour of a museum. She identified every room. She did not explain what any of them were actually used for. Lillian thanked her and went to find the kitchen. She made herself toast. Standing at the counter of a kitchen that cost more than her car had when it was new, she ate toast and thought about her father and thought about what her life had looked like 3 months ago and tried to locate some through line that made sense of where she was standing now. She was still standing there when the back door opened and a woman she didn't recognize walked in like she owned the place, because she was the kind of woman who walked everywhere like she owned it. Elena Vasquez was 44 years old and had been the wife of Nico Vasquez, capo of the South Side operations and Damian's second oldest associate, for 19 years. She was tall, impeccably dressed, even at 9 in the morning, and she had the kind of bone structure that other women noticed before men did. She stopped in the middle of the kitchen and looked at Lillian standing there in plain jeans with a piece of toast and an expression that was the human equivalent of a category error. "Oh," Elena said, "you're already up." "I'm a morning person," Lillian said. Elena set her bag on the kitchen island and looked around the room with the proprietary ease of someone who had been using this kitchen for years. "Damian asked me to stop by. I help coordinate social things for the family." The word family had a particular weight in her mouth that was distinct from its ordinary meaning. "We'll need to get you oriented." "Oriented," Lillian repeated. "There are expectations," Elena said, turning to look at her directly for the first time. The look was fast and comprehensive, the kind that files things away. The way you dress, the events you attend, what you say, and who you say it to. A brief pause. "And what you don't say." Lillian took a bite of her toast. "I've been a waitress for 6 years," she said. "I know how to be quiet in a room." Elena smiled. It was a precise, controlled thing that didn't involve her eyes at all. "Being a waitress and being Damian Moretti's wife are somewhat different positions." "I know that too." "Good." Elena picked up her bag. "I'll send you a schedule. There's a dinner Wednesday. The Palermo family is in from Milwaukee. You'll need to be dressed appropriately. Another one of those filing cabinet looks. I'll send someone to help with that as well. She left the same way she came in. The back door closed with a soft, expensive click. Lillian finished her toast. She washed her plate. She stood at the kitchen window and watched a sparrow sitting on the edge of the garden wall, and she thought very clearly, this is going to be a problem. She was right. She just didn't know yet how many problems there were going to be, or how many of them would be wearing good shoes. The Wednesday dinner was at Nico Vasquez's house in Hyde Park, a Georgian revival that had been renovated in a way that cost a great deal of money to look like it hadn't. There were 16 people at the table. Lillian knew Damien, and she recognized 2 other faces from the wedding. Everyone else was new. The women sat at one end. This was not announced or arranged officially. It was simply what happened, with the casual choreography of a ritual that had been performed many times. Lillian found herself between Elena and a woman named Carla Benedetti, whose husband ran port operations and who wore a diamond tennis bracelet that she touched approximately every 4 minutes in a way that suggested it was both an asset and a nervous habit. "Where are you from originally?" Carla asked, which sounded like a simple question and wasn't. "Uptown," Lillian said. "North Side." The sound Carla made was not unfriendly exactly. It was the sound of a door closing politely. "And your family?" "My father's in Evanston. He's retired military." This landed with a small silence that told her something about how the table regarded military backgrounds. Not with hostility, but with the faint incomprehension of people whose world had different structures. "No other family?" Elena asked from her left without looking up from her plate. "No other family." Carla said again. The conversation moved on. Lillian ate her dinner. She listened more than she spoke, which was her natural inclination and which she was aware was being interpreted as either shyness or stupidity by at least 3 of the women at the end of the table. She didn't correct the interpretation. Her father had always said that being underestimated was a resource, not an insult. But she was not prepared, not fully, not yet, for Elena. The dessert course arrived and the conversation had shifted to the subject of the upcoming fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, which was apparently an annual event and a significant social marker, and Elena turned to Lillian with the brightness of someone about to be kind in a way that wasn't, and said, "We'll need to think carefully about your role, of course. These events require a certain presence. People will be curious about Damien's choice." A small pause, perfectly weighted. "We want to make sure the impression is the right one." The table didn't go quiet. It just angled slightly, the way rooms do when people are pretending they're not listening. "What impression are you worried about?" Lillian asked. Elena tilted her head. "People will have questions. About how you met, about your background. It's natural." "My background is that I'm a person who worked for a living," Lillian said. "I'm not embarrassed about it." "Of course not," Elena said, smooth as river water. "It's charming, really. Damien's always been unpredictable." Another small pause. "We just want to make sure you're comfortable. In this world, it takes time to find your footing." Lillian put down her fork. She looked at Elena directly and said, in a voice that was conversational and utterly calm, "I have good footing. Thank you for the concern." Elena smiled. Carla touched her bracelet. Someone across the table said something to someone else about the hospital gala committee, and the moment dissolved. But it left a mark. Lillian felt it the whole drive home. The specific discomfort of having been managed in public by someone who was very good at managing people in public, and who had wanted her to feel it. Not angry, tired in a particular way. The kind of tired that comes from having to defend your right to be in a room. Damien was in his study when she got home. He looked up when she came in and read something in her face with that unsettling accuracy of his. "How was it?" "Fine," she said. "Lillian." She looked at him. He was sitting at his desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and he looked not approachable exactly, but present in a way that made honesty seem like the least complicated option. "Elena is going to be an issue," she said. "I know." "You knew before tonight?" "Elena is always an issue," he said. "She's also extremely useful, and she's been with this family longer than most people who work for me directly." He looked at her carefully. "She's not dangerous, she's territorial. That's a distinction I'll care about more when she's not trying to make me feel like a mistake in your living room." Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. "I'll talk to her." "Don't," Lillian said immediately. He raised an eyebrow. If you talk to her, I become someone who needed protecting. I'll handle it myself. Another one of those long looks of his, calibrating. All right, he said finally. And he meant it, which was the thing she was still learning about him. He said what he meant. He didn't negotiate his agreements after he made them. She went to bed. She lay in the large, quiet room and stared at the ceiling and thought that she had managed to survive 6 years in high-end service hospitality, 2 years of watching her father's health decline, and 31 years of being the kind of woman who people looked through rather than at. She was not going to be undone by a woman with good bone structure and a territorial streak. What she didn't know was that Elena's problem with her was not primarily personal. It was practical. And it was connected to things that were moving in rooms Lillian hadn't been invited into yet. She's not a liability. She doesn't have to be a liability to get hurt. The voices moved away. Lillian stood in the library with a book she'd stopped reading and thought about the word target, and thought about the name Ricci, and thought about her father's voice explaining to her when she was 14 that the moment someone started asking questions about the people around you was the moment the game had already changed. She put the book back on the shelf exactly where she'd found it and went downstairs and made dinner, because it was the thing she could do with her hands. And she had always thought better when her hands were doing something. She met the other wives in the weeks that followed with the patient attention she'd once given to memorizing the dietary restrictions of hotel guests. Careful, thorough, looking for the structure underneath the surface. What she found was not what she'd expected. She had expected hostility. She had expected closed ranks, cold shoulders, the kind of feminine politics that was really just power in a different costume. She found some of that. Elena's group, 4 women whose husbands sat closest to Damien in the hierarchy, maintained a social architecture that Lillian was not invited inside, and they maintained it with the kind of precision that required active effort rather than passive exclusion. But she also found Marta Sorrento, whose husband Tony ran the North Shore operations, and who had been born in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Milwaukee, and who had married into this world at 22 and had spent 15 years watching other women look at her the same way they now looked at Lillian. Marta was 41, direct in a way that was almost startling in that environment, and she said, on the first occasion she and Lillian were seated near each other, "Elena doesn't actually hate you." "I know," Lillian said. Marta looked at her with something like reassessment. "Most women think she does. She's protecting something. It's different from hate." "What do you think she's protecting?" Lillian considered the question honestly. Her position. Maybe Damien's first wife's memory, or the idea of her. Maybe just the order she's built. She looked at Marta. What was his first wife like? Marta was quiet for a moment in a way that had texture to it. She was from this world, born into it. Her father was significant. She died 4 years ago. Cancer. Another pause. She and Elena were very close. Lillian absorbed that. That's useful to know. Most people don't ask, Marta said. Most people don't want the complicated answer. Marta almost smiled. No, they don't. It wasn't a friendship, not exactly, but it was something. A foothold in the social landscape that was not built on Damien's authority or Elena's tolerance. It was hers, small and real, and she protected it the way she protected everything that was hers. The contract appeared 6 weeks into the marriage. Lillian came down to breakfast on a Saturday morning to find Elena already in the house. Again, that proprietary ease, the back door, the assumption of access, sitting at the kitchen table with a leather folder and a cup of Rose's coffee. Damien was at a meeting that had started at 6 in the morning, which was apparently normal. Lillian had stopped being surprised by the hours. "I need your signature on something," Elena said, sliding the folder across the table before Lillian had even sat down. She opened it. 3 pages. Dense language, the kind written specifically to be difficult to parse on first reading. She read it anyway. She read all 3 pages, slowly, while Elena sat across from her with an expression of polite patience. What it said, reduced to its essential meaning, was this: Lillian Brooks, now Lillian Moretti, agreed to make no claim on any asset, financial account, property, or business interest currently held by or affiliated with Damien Moretti or the Moretti family structure, in exchange for an unspecified consideration that was described in language vague enough to mean nothing binding. She set the folder down. She looked at Elena. Damien asked you to bring this? She said. Something very small happened in Elena's expression. It's standard, Elena said. For arrangements like yours, protective for everyone. Protective for who? For the family, for Damien's interests. You'd be protected too. It clarifies your position. My position is Damien's wife, Lillian said. That seems fairly clear already. Lillian. Elena leaned forward slightly, and the performance of patience dropped a fraction, which was actually more interesting than the performance had been. I'm going to be honest with you. You came from nowhere. You have no history here, no family backing, no understanding of what it took to build what Damien has built. The people in this world, they're watching. They're wondering why you're here and how long you'll stay. This document is a way of managing that uncertainty. For them. For everyone. Lillian folded her hands on the table. Her voice stayed exactly the same temperature it had been since the conversation started. Not cold, not heated, just even. Elena, I heard what you said at Nico's dinner. I heard what you said the week after that at the Martinelli lunch. I understand that you have a long history with this family, and that my being here is disruptive to things that were ordered in a particular way. She paused. I'm not signing this. Silence. Without talking to Damien first, Lillian added, he knows about it. Then he can tell me that himself. Elena's jaw tightened, just slightly, the only visible crack in the whole construction. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. I'm not making anything difficult, Lillian said. I'm not signing a document that someone brought to my kitchen on a Saturday morning while my husband is at a meeting. She pushed the folder back across the table. You want coffee? Rosa made it about 20 minutes ago. Elena stared at her. Then she picked up the folder, put it in her bag, and left. Lillian poured herself coffee. Her hands were completely steady. She was aware that she had just done something that would have consequences. She was also aware that not doing it would have had worse ones. She called Damien. He picked up on the second ring. Elena came by, she said. A pause on his end. I heard. Did you ask her to bring a document? Another pause, shorter. No. The word landed in her chest like something solidifying. Okay, she said. Lillian, I need you to understand something, she said, and her voice was still even, still calm, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. I didn't marry you to sign away my position the first time someone decided I was inconvenient. If that's what this arrangement requires, you need to tell me now. That's not what this arrangement requires. His voice was flat and certain. I'll handle Elena. I told you, you don't need to. This is different, he said. This is not her being territorial. This is her acting on someone else's instruction, which means the problem is not Elena. The silence that followed had a different quality than the others. Who? She said. I don't know yet. A pause. Stay in the house today. Damien, please, he said, which was a word she had learned he did not use as a reflex, and its appearance now told her something about the temperature of what he knew that he wasn't saying. Just today. She stayed in the house. She read. She helped Rosa reorganize the pantry because she needed to do something with her hands. She thought about the conversation between Damien and Vincent she'd overheard, and the name Ricci, and a document brought to her kitchen by a woman who should have had no reason to bring it. She thought about her father's voice saying, when someone tries to reduce your position, they're preparing for something. The reduction comes first, then the removal. By evening, she had a headache that sat behind her eyes like something pressing from the inside. Damien came home at 9 and looked at her across the kitchen and said, very quietly, the document was Nico Vasquez's idea. She processed that. Nico. Elena's husband. Damien's second oldest associate. Why? Because someone is paying him to make you seem like a liability before they move against me directly. His voice was controlled in that way it got when he was managing something that was not under control. He's been in contact with the Ricci family for at least 6 weeks. Since before the wedding. Since before the wedding. She sat down at the kitchen table. Her headache intensified. So Elena didn't know. Probably not everything. Nico is careful. She still came to my kitchen with a document. She thought she was doing the right thing for the family. A pause. She thought she was protecting Damien, his money, his interests. She didn't know she was protecting Ricci's plan. Lillian looked at her hands on the table. What are you going to do? I need to verify before I move. I need the financial connection, not just the meetings. And in the meantime? He looked at her steadily. In the meantime, I need you to keep appearing at events. Keep being present. If you disappear from the social calendar right now, it signals to Ricci that I know something's moving. She looked up at him. You want me to be the thing that makes them think nothing's changed? Yes. While you find the financial connection. Yes. She breathed in. She breathed out. She thought about that dinner at Nico's house 6 weeks ago, and Elena's smile and the table angled to listen, and the whole performance of it, and she thought about what it meant that she'd been sitting in that room being managed while a plan was already being assembled around her like a frame around a photograph. All right, she said. Lillian. He crossed the kitchen and sat across from her, which was something he did rarely. Usually he stood, always in motion. Sitting meant something. I need to know you understand what I'm asking. You're asking me to be visible while you work. I'm asking you to trust me enough to stay in the open when every instinct you have is probably telling you to go somewhere safe. She looked at him. My instincts have never told me to go somewhere safe, she said. My father didn't raise me that way. For a long moment, he just looked at her, and she could see him doing that thing he did, calibrating, measuring, deciding what was true. What he found seemed to settle something in him. There's a retreat next weekend, he said. The senior families. Mountain house in Wisconsin. I was going to cancel it. Don't, she said immediately. It's isolated. If Ricci decides to move early, if Ricci thinks you canceled because of him, he'll move faster. She had her father's voice in her head now, steady and precise. The voice from 100 training sessions in their small apartment. Retreat signals weakness. Weakness invites attack. If you have to be in the open on your terms. Go. I'll go with you. Damien was quiet for a moment. You're certain? She was not certain. She was 31 years old, and she was sitting in a kitchen that cost more than her former apartment building. And she had a headache that wouldn't quit, and somewhere across the city, a man named Ricci was making plans that included her removal as a line item. She was not certain of anything except that the alternative, retreating, reducing, becoming exactly the liability that Nico Vasquez's document wanted to make her, felt worse than whatever was waiting in Wisconsin. Book the rooms, she said. He nodded once. He got up. He made her a cup of tea without asking whether she wanted one, which was something she'd noticed he did when he was managing his own worry about something and needed something to do with his hands. She sat at the kitchen table with the tea and the headache, and the particular cold clarity that had been her father's greatest gift to her. The ability to look at a dangerous situation and not blink first. She didn't know there would be 3 men in that mountain house with weapons and instructions. She didn't know that Damien would be pulled away at exactly the right moment, at exactly the right hour, by a message carefully constructed to read like urgency. She didn't know that when the lights went out in the stone mansion at the edge of the Wisconsin wilderness, she would be alone in the dark with nothing but what her father had spent 15 years teaching her. But some part of her, the part that had stood in a hotel corridor with a wet towel and made a decision that changed everything, already knew that whatever was coming, she was not going to meet it sitting down. The drive to Wisconsin took 4 hours. Lillian spent most of it watching the landscape change through the passenger window, the city giving way to suburbs, suburbs giving way to the flat gray expanse of late November farmland, then the first suggestion of hills, then the hills themselves, dark with pine and bare oak, and the particular silence of places that don't get much traffic. Damien drove. He didn't talk much on drives, which she had learned was not discomfort, but concentration. He used movement to think, and he thought better without narration. She was fine with that. She had things to think about too. The Moretti Mountain House was not what the word house implied. It was a stone and timber structure built into the hillside in the 1960s by Damien's grandfather, expanded twice since, with enough rooms to sleep 20 and enough land around it that the nearest neighbor was a 40-minute drive down an unpaved road. It sat at the end of a private access road that wound through dense Wisconsin forest for 3 miles before the gate appeared, and past the gate the trees pressed in from both sides so closely that the headlights barely reached the shoulders. Lillian watched the gate close behind them in the side mirror and thought about the word isolated that Damien had used when he'd first mentioned the retreat. and breathed through the small tightening in her chest that she would not call fear because it wasn't exactly fear. It was the physical alertness that her father had taught her to recognize and use rather than suppress. Your body knows things your brain is still catching up to, he told her once, sitting across from her in their small kitchen with a topographic map spread between them and the particular patience of someone who understood that some lessons had to be taught twice, 3 times, a dozen times before they became reflex. Don't apologize for it. Just listen. She was listening. The senior families arrived in staggered intervals over the course of Friday afternoon and evening. 6 couples total, plus Damien's inner circle of 4. Men whose specific roles Lillian understood only in outline, whose history with Damien ran back decades, and whose loyalty was, as far as she could observe, genuine. There was Vincent, the older man whose voice she'd heard in the garden, who greeted her with a gruff nod, and the faint surprise of someone who had expected her to be smaller somehow. There was Tommy Chen, who handled what Damien referred to as structural matters, and who said almost nothing to anyone but observed everything with the focused attention of a man who was paid to notice things other people missed. And there was Nico Vasquez, who arrived with Elena at 7 on Friday evening and shook Damien's hand in the entrance hall and kissed Lillian on the cheek and said, "Good to see you here, Lillian. Looks good on you. The mountain air." With the ease of a man who had been performing ease for so long, it had become his resting state. Lillian smiled. She said thank you. She watched him move through the entrance hall with the proprietary comfort of a man in familiar territory, and she felt the back of her neck do something that she paid attention to. Elena beside him met Lillian's eyes briefly. Something passed through Elena's expression that was not quite guilt and not quite warning, something more complicated than either, the expression of a woman who knew more than she'd been told and was not entirely certain what to do with that knowledge. Lillian filed it. She moved on. Friday night was dinner and the performance of normalcy, conversation about business in the language these people used for business, which was oblique and referential and required fluency in a context Lillian was still building, though she understood more of it now than she had 6 weeks ago. She ate. She listened. She said the right things in the right amounts, which for her meant less than most people said, and chosen more carefully. Damien sat at the head of the table and managed the room the way he managed everything, without apparent effort, which was itself a kind of effort, the effort of someone who had spent decades learning to make control look like ease. Nico sat to his left and talked more than anyone else at the table, which Lillian was also filing, because in her experience, the loudest voice in a room was usually either the most confident or the most nervous, and she was becoming increasingly certain which one Nico was. She went to bed at 11. Damien stayed downstairs. She lay in the unfamiliar dark and listened to the house settle around her. The sounds it made were different from the Lincoln Park house, older, more organic, the sounds of stone and timber adjusting to the cold. And she slept in the shallow, alert way she'd learned from her father, the way that wasn't really sleep so much as rest with the lights left on inside. Saturday was the meeting. It ran from 9 in the morning until mid-afternoon, in the large room at the back of the house that Damien's grandfather had built for exactly this purpose. Long table, no windows on the north wall, a single door. Lillian was not in the meeting. This was not something she objected to or was surprised by. She understood that there were rooms she was not yet meant to be in, and she used the time to do what she always did when she had unstructured hours in a place she didn't know well. She learned the house. She walked every hallway. She opened every door that wasn't locked and noted the ones that were. She identified the exits, 3 main ones, plus a service door at the back of the kitchen and a ground floor window in the utility room that had a latch that didn't fully engage. She noted where the light switches were in relation to the exits. She noted where the furniture was heaviest and most fixed. She walked the perimeter of the building in the cold afternoon air, her breath making small clouds, her feet learning the ground, where it was even, where it sloped, where the stone path ended and the grass began and where the grass gave way to the tree line. She was not doing this because she planned to need it. She was doing it because her father had made it as automatic as breathing. You walk into any new space, you learn it, not because something's wrong, because something might be, and if it is, you won't have time to learn it then. She went back inside at 3:30. Rosa had come with them. Rosa went everywhere the household went. And she was in the kitchen making something that smelled like the only uncomplicated thing in the building. Lillian sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and helped Rosa with prep work because it felt good to do something with her hands. And they talked about small things, practical things, in the easy rhythm of two women who had learned to find each other's company useful. At 4:15, Damien appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her and said, "Can you give us a minute, Rosa?" And Rosa dried her hands and left with the unhurried dignity of a woman who had been navigating rooms like this for 11 years. Damien sat down across from Lillian. "Tommy pulled the financial thread," he said. She set down her coffee. "And?" "Ricci paid Nico through 3 shell companies. It goes back 8 months. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly. Something colder than anger. The thing that came after anger, when the anger had finished burning and left something harder behind. He wasn't just working with Ricci, he helped structure the original approach to Marcus Trent. Lillian absorbed that. "Nico set up the man who was stealing from you. Before I met you, before room 7. He paused. "Which means the night you overheard that conversation wasn't an accident." The kitchen was very quiet. "They wanted you to hear it," she said slowly. "They wanted me to find out about Trent through a source I'd trust. A civilian with nothing to gain. Someone who'd make the information clean." He looked at her steadily. "They needed me distracted, focused on the traitor in front of me, while the real structure was being built around me." She thought about standing in that corridor with a wet towel and a broken carafe. She thought about the way the door had swung open at exactly the moment she was stuck there, unable to move. She thought about a man in a gray suit taking a phone call in a service corridor of a hotel where private meetings were handled by experienced staff who knew better than to leave doors open during sensitive conversations. "He opened that door on purpose," she said. "Yes. They knew I was there. They knew someone would be there. They chose a room with a service corridor access for exactly that reason." A pause. "They just didn't know you'd actually come upstairs. That wasn't part of the plan." "No." Something shifted in his expression, something she couldn't fully name, but which had weight to it. "You weren't supposed to warn me. You were supposed to hear enough to repeat it to someone else, and that someone else would eventually get it to me in a way that was deniable and slow. You going upstairs directly, that night, that disrupted their timeline." She sat with that for a moment. The whole shape of the last 4 months rearranging itself around this new fact, every scene playing back with different lighting. The elevator, the lobby, the suite on the 47th floor, the dinner on Thursday, the proposal in January. "So when you married me," she said, and her voice was careful and very controlled, "was any of it? Did any of it come from—" "No." He said it immediately, and the immediacy of it was the most honest thing she'd heard from him. "I married you because of who you are, not because of what they planned." He held her eyes. "I need you to know the difference between those things." She looked at him for a long time. "I know the difference," she said finally. He exhaled. A small thing, almost invisible, but she saw it. "What do you do now?" she asked. "Tonight," he said, "I let Nico think the meeting went normally. Tomorrow morning, I move him out." His jaw tightened. 19 years. She understood what that meant. Not just the logistics of it, the weight of 19 years of shared meals and shared work, and the particular intimacy of trusting someone with things that mattered, and discovering that the trust had been exploited from a direction you never thought to check. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her like the words had surprised him. "Don't be, it's—" He stopped. Started again. "It's done. It's information. I handle information. You can handle it and still be sorry it's true." A pause. "Yes," he said quietly. "I can." Dinner Saturday night was the same performance as Friday, and Lillian gave it everything she had, which was considerable. She talked to Elena about the Children's Hospital Gala with genuine attention. She asked Carla Benedetti about her daughter's school application with the patience of someone who actually cared about the answer. She watched Nico across the table tell a story about a fishing trip in a way that made everyone laugh, and she smiled in the right places, and she thought about 8 months and shell companies and a door opened on purpose in a hotel corridor, and she kept her hand still and her face exactly where she needed it to be. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Waitressing had taught her that the most important skill in any room was the ability to be present and invisible at the same time, to manage your own internal state with enough precision that nothing leaked into your expression that you didn't authorize. After dinner, she went upstairs. Damien stayed down. He would manage Nico through the evening, keep him comfortable, give nothing away. She trusted him to do that. What she didn't expect was the knock on her door at 11:30. She was still dressed. She'd been sitting on the edge of the bed reading without absorbing anything, which was not a state she was familiar with, and she crossed to the door and opened it to find Elena standing in the hallway in a robe, without makeup, looking like a different person than she was at dinner. Smaller, more tired. The performance had come down for the night, and what was underneath it was a woman who hadn't slept properly in what looked like weeks. "Can I come in?" Elena asked. Lillian stepped back. Elena came in and stood in the middle of the room and looked at the floor for a moment like she was choosing her words from a limited supply. "I didn't know," she said finally. "About the financial piece. About Ricci." She looked up. "I knew Nico was maneuvering. He maneuvers. It's what he does. It's always what he's done. And for 19 years, it's been on the right side of the line." Her voice cracked slightly on the word 19, and she pulled it back with visible effort. "I thought the document was his idea of protecting the family. I didn't know he was protecting an exit." Lillian looked at her for a long moment. "How much do you know now?" "Enough." Elena's hands were not steady. She pressed them together in front of her. "Damien is going to move him out." "Yes? Is he—" She stopped. "Will Nico—" "I don't know," Lillian said, because she didn't, and lying about it would have been unkind in the particular way that false comfort is unkind. It makes people feel better now, and worse later when the truth arrives anyway. Elena nodded. A very small nod. The nod of someone absorbing something that has been half expected and is still, somehow, a shock. "I brought you that document," she said. "I sat across from you at 6 dinners, and I was trying to move you out of a position that I thought you didn't belong in." A pause. "I owe you an apology." "You owe me an honest answer," Lillian said. Elena looked at her. Did Damien's first wife, would she have handled this? What's happening right now? A long silence. Elena's expression moved through several things. "Margaret was extraordinary," she said finally. "She was born into this world. She understood every piece of it. She was the right person for it." A pause. She would have been devastated by this. She trusted Nico completely. She'd known him since she was a child. Elena looked at Lillian steadily. "You're not Margaret." "No." "You handle things differently." Elena's voice was quiet now, stripped of its usual precision. "You sat through dinner tonight, and I was watching you, and I couldn't find a single moment where you slipped." She shook her head. "I've known women who trained for this their whole lives who couldn't do that." Lillian said nothing. "I've been wrong about you," Elena said. "I want you to know I know that." "Thank you for telling me," Lillian said, and she meant it, without warmth and without coldness, just accurately. Elena left. Lillian closed the door. She stood in the middle of the room in the dark old house on the Wisconsin hillside and listened to the wind moving through the pines outside and thought about Margaret Moretti, whom she had never met, and about the particular loneliness of being compared to a ghost, and about Elena's face when she'd said 19 years, and about all the ways that loyalty could be the most destructive thing in the room. She went to bed at midnight. She set no alarm because she didn't need one. At 2:47 in the morning, her eyes opened. She didn't know why at first. The room was dark. The house was quiet. The wind was still doing what it had been doing for hours. Then she heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of a sound that should have been there. The low, almost imperceptible hum of the security system that she'd registered without consciously noting it every hour since their arrival. It was gone. She was out of bed before the thought completed itself, moving to the wall beside the door rather than across the open center of the room, pressing herself flat, listening with everything she had. Her father's voice in her head. Power going out can be weather. Power going out in a house with a backup generator is someone's choice. Her phone was on the nightstand. She crossed to it in 3 fast, silent steps, grabbed it, and tried to call Damien. No signal. She stood in the dark with the dead phone in her hand and felt the cold come up through the floor through her socks and thought very clearly and very fast. Damien's room was at the end of the hall, west wing. She had walked this hall twice yesterday, once in each direction, and she knew it the way she knew everything she'd catalogued: door frames, a side table midway, the runner rug that ended 2 feet before the staircase. She knew it in the dark, which was what mattered now. She opened her door. The hallway was black and smelled like pine and old stone and cold air that was moving from a direction it shouldn't have been moving from, which meant a door or window open on the ground floor. She moved to Damien's room. Empty. Bed slept in, covers pushed back, boots gone from the floor. He'd left before this, before the power went out. She touched the pillow. Still slightly warm, recent. She heard the front door. Not opening, closing. The soft but distinct click of a heavy door brought carefully shut by someone who did not want to make noise and didn't quite manage to make none. She moved to the window. Through the glass she could see the front drive, the faint shapes of the vehicles, the dark tree line, and one other thing, a set of taillights disappearing down the access road, Damien's car. She stood at the window for 3 seconds, 3 full, deliberate seconds, and ran the math. Damien was gone. Someone had cut the power and the signal. The access road was the only way in or out, and a car had just gone down it. Her father's voice, from a training session when she was 16 and had been frustrated by a scenario that felt unrealistic. It doesn't matter if you think it's going to happen. If you've prepared for it, you can handle it. If you haven't, you can't. Prepare for everything. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, slow, controlled. Then she heard the first footstep on the stairs. Not Rosa. Rosa slept in the east-facing room and moved like a larger person, with the confident heaviness of someone comfortable in the house. This was something else. Someone who knew where the stairs were, but not where the third step from the bottom creaked, which it did, which told her this person had been in this house before, or had been given a floor plan that didn't include the kind of detail you only got from living somewhere. One person on the stairs. She tilted her head, listened with the training that made other sounds recede. 2 more. Ground floor. Different part of the house, moving toward the kitchen, the service approach, the back way that she had found and logged on her walkthrough yesterday afternoon. 3 total. Coming from 2 directions. She stood in Damien's room in her socks and the clothes she'd slept in, because she'd gone to bed dressed, which was her father's habit, and now hers, because you don't get time to change when something goes wrong at night. And she made a decision in the space of 1 breath. She did not go for the door. She went for the window, not to escape. The drop from the 2nd floor to the stone terrace below was survivable but loud, and loud was the one thing she absolutely could not be. She went to the window to unlatch it and leave it precisely, deliberately, 1 inch open. Then she crossed back to the door and through it and into the hallway. And she went left instead of right, away from the stairs toward the north end of the hall where the linen storage room was. A door she'd opened yesterday to find shelving units in darkness, and at the back, a 2nd door that connected to a service passage that ran down to the kitchen level. She was in the linen room with the door pulled to, not latched, not clicked, just resting in the frame, when the footsteps on the stairs reached the top. She stood in the dark between 2 shelving units and breathed through her mouth in absolute silence and listened to a person move down the hallway toward Damien's room. Male. Heavy in the shoulders, she could tell from the footfall distribution. Weight forward, not heel striking. Someone trained to move quietly, who was nonetheless bigger than he wanted to be for this kind of work. The footsteps stopped outside Damien's room. A pause. Long enough that she counted 12 of her own heartbeats. Then, West Hall clear. A voice barely above a murmur. Room's empty, windows open. A reply from somewhere below, too muffled to parse the words but clear enough to identify. A second voice, and the quality of it, clipped, professional, the tone of someone coordinating rather than improvising. Then a third voice, from the kitchen direction, audible because the service passage she was standing next to was a sound channel running straight down through the wall. She's not in the kitchen, start the sweep. She had perhaps 4 minutes before the systematic search of the upstairs reached the linen room. She could feel her pulse in her throat, which was information. It told her she was afraid, which she expected, and that the fear was functional rather than paralyzing, which was the thing her father had worked to give her most of all. Not the absence of fear, the ability to use it. She turned in the dark and found the inner door to the service passage by feel and pushed it open and descended. The passage was narrow, shoulder width, stone, lit by nothing. She moved down it with one hand trailing the wall, feet finding the steps one at a time, counting as she went because she'd counted them on the way up yesterday. 14 steps to the kitchen level, then a left turn, and 12 feet to the door that opened behind the pantry shelving unit. 12, 11, 10. At 6, she heard one of the men enter the kitchen from the main door. She stopped. She pressed herself against the cold stone and waited while the sound of someone moving through the kitchen went from close to slightly less close, moving toward the far side, toward the family dining area. She went the rest of the way down. The pantry door was a push. She pushed it 2 inches and saw through the gap the kitchen as a field of shapes in darkness. The island, the far counter, the window above the sink with the faint suggestion of night sky. The man who'd come in was not visible, still in the dining room or moved through it. She had the service door in her mind. Back of the kitchen, left of the sink, 10 feet from where she was standing. She came through the pantry door and crossed the kitchen in the dark and found the service door handle and pressed down on the latch and came out into the cold Wisconsin night and the sound of the pines and the smell of snow that wasn't falling yet but was thinking about it. She was outside. She was alive. She was in her socks on a stone path in below freezing temperature with no phone, no car, no weapon, and 3 trained men in the house behind her who were about to realize she wasn't in it. She stood at the edge of the stone path where it met the grass, and the grass met the tree line, and she felt the cold come up through her feet, and she looked at the darkness of the forest ahead and thought about what her father had said about environments. The most dangerous man in a forest is not the one with the best weapon. It's the one who knows the forest better than anyone hunting him. She had walked the perimeter of this building for 30 minutes yesterday. She knew this ground. She stepped off the path and into the trees, and she did not run, because running in the dark through unfamiliar forest was how you broke an ankle and ended everything. She moved fast and low and controlled, and behind her she heard through the trees the sound of the service door opening, the sound of a man stepping onto the stone path and stopping. "She's outside," the voice said. Calm, professional, already recalibrating. "She went into the trees." A pause. "Don't worry about quiet anymore," a different voice said closer to the house. "Just find her." Lillian was already 30 meters into the forest, moving parallel to the access road without getting close enough to be visible from it. And she was doing the things she had been trained to do since she was 14 years old. She was not thinking about fear or cold or the men behind her or what happened if they caught her before Damien came back. She was thinking about the terrain, the slope of the hill, the way sound traveled in pine forest versus deciduous, where the ground was soft enough to muffle footsteps and where it was frozen hard enough to amplify them. She was thinking about the 3 exits she'd cataloged from the building and what each of them implied about where trained men would position themselves once they understood she was outside. She was thinking about what her father had taught her about being hunted. "If you're smaller and slower and outnumbered," he'd said, "you don't survive by running. You survive by making the space work for you and against them. You pick the ground. You set the terms. You don't let them choose the battlefield." She had picked the ground yesterday afternoon in the cold November air while she walked the perimeter of a stone house in Wisconsin, and she had not known she was doing it for this reason. She had done it anyway. And in the darkness between the pines, Lillian Brooks, who had been a waitress, who was now someone's wife, who was about to become something that had no name yet in any world she'd previously inhabited, stopped running and started thinking like the thing they hadn't expected her to be. The first thing she did was take off her socks. Not because of any strategy she'd. Her father had never specifically addressed Wisconsin pine forest in November at 3 in the morning, but because wet wool on frozen ground was loud in a way that bare feet on pine needles were not, and she needed the ground information anyway. She needed to feel where it was soft and where it had crusted over with frost, where the needles were deep enough to absorb a footstep, and where the exposed root systems would snap underfoot like dry wood. The cold hit her feet like a physical blow, and she breathed through it, controlled, deliberate. Cold was information, not an emergency. Her father had made her stand barefoot in snow at 15 until she understood the difference between pain that was dangerous and pain that was just pain. She stuffed the socks into her waistband and moved. She had roughly a 3-minute lead, maybe less. The man who'd come out the service door was professional enough to not waste time shouting. She'd heard him go back inside, which meant he was regrouping rather than pursuing alone, which meant they were going to come at her organized, which was both better and worse than panicked. Better, because panicked men made noise. Worse, because organized men covered ground methodically. She moved northeast along the slope, staying 20 meters inside the tree line, far enough to be invisible from the house, close enough that she could see the building's lights if they came back on. The slope was gentle here, rising gradually toward a ridge she'd seen from the perimeter walk. She'd noticed a rock outcropping at the top, which meant a position with elevation and cover, and, more importantly, a line of sight across most of the property. Her feet found a frozen patch, and she slowed, shifted her weight, stepped around it. Every footstep a decision, every breath measured. Behind her, 70 meters back and to her left, she heard the crunch of someone entering the trees. Single person. Moving faster than she was, which meant he was prioritizing speed over silence, which meant he was confident, and that confidence was going to cost him because confidence made you loud. She stopped. She pressed herself against the near side of a pine trunk, the uphill side, where he'd be looking past her rather than at her. And she waited and she counted. The footsteps came on for 8 seconds, then slowed, then stopped. He'd lost her sound. She heard him breathing from 20 meters out, big chest, working harder than he wanted to. He turned. She tracked it by the shift in his breathing direction, and she saw the pale shape of a flashlight beam sweep left across the forest floor about 30 meters ahead of her position. He'd overshot. She moved while he was looking away, uphill, faster now, using his noise to cover hers, and she made the ridge in 90 seconds and went flat behind the rock outcropping and looked back down the slope. 3 flashlight beams. 2 on the far side of the property, near the access road. 1 in the trees behind her, still sweeping left and right below her position. They were spreading out, which was correct search technique for an open environment, but this wasn't an open environment, and spreading out was also, in pine forest at night, how you lost coordination. She was above them. She thought about her father's voice. Elevation is leverage. Once you have it, you don't give it up unless you're trading it for something better. She needed a weapon. This was the problem she'd been running the math on since she left the house. 3 men, presumably armed, working as a coordinated unit. Her, barefoot, no phone, no weapon, no allies. The arithmetic was not in her favor on a flat field. It was marginally less terrible on ground she knew, and they didn't, but marginally less terrible was not a plan. She needed to change the arithmetic. She thought about the house, the service corridor, the kitchen, the utility room with the latch that didn't engage fully. She thought about what was in the utility room. She'd opened that door on her walkthrough. She closed her eyes on the dark ridge and rebuilt it from memory the way her father had taught her to rebuild spaces. Metal shelving units on the left wall. Cleaning supplies. A chest freezer. A second shelf unit on the right with tools. She'd seen the outline of a toolbox on the lower shelf, and above it, hanging on wall hooks, the shapes of long-handled implements. A snow shovel. What looked like an axe handle. The utility room was 20 feet inside the service door that she'd come out of 6 minutes ago, while at least one of the 3 men was inside the main house. She needed to go back in. The thought sat in her chest with a particular kind of weight. Not fear exactly. The fear was present. It was always present. It was the engine, not the obstacle. But the weight of understanding that what she was considering was objectively the most dangerous available option, and that it was also the most correct one, because the alternative was staying in the trees until cold and exhaustion made the decision for someone else. Her feet were going numb. She had maybe 20 minutes of useful mobility in this temperature before the cold became a real tactical liability. She watched the flashlight beams below her. The man in the trees had moved west, away from her, following a ghost of her trail. The 2 near the access road were moving slowly along the fence line, checking the perimeter, which told her they thought she might try for the gate. The service door side of the house was facing her, facing the slope, and in this moment it was the least watched side. She went back down the hill. She went fast and low, in a diagonal line that kept the tree trunks between her and the access road lights, and she felt her feet on the frozen ground sending signals that were half sensation and half just cold, and she focused on the house, the shape of it growing as she descended, the service door in her mind like a fixed point. She hit the grass at the edge of the tree line and crossed it in 8 running steps, and pressed herself against the stone wall of the house beside the service door and stopped and listened. Inside, footsteps. Single person, in the main part of the house, moving toward the front, away from her. She pressed the service door latch and pushed and came inside. The kitchen was dark. She crossed it from memory, 14 steps, island on her right, sink ahead, turn left. And she found the utility room door and pushed it open and stood in the darkness among the shapes of things her memory had catalogued. Her hands found the wall hooks. Snow shovel, too long, too unwieldy. Her fingers moved right and found the axe handle, no blade attached, 28 inches of ash wood with the weight of something useful. She took it off the hook, then her hand found something else on the lower shelf. She picked it up and identified it by shape. A work flashlight, heavy rubber casing, the kind that didn't break when you dropped it. She did not turn it on. She held the axe handle in her right hand and the flashlight in her left, and she stood in the utility room and breathed. 1 man in the house, 2 outside. She had a weapon now, which changed the arithmetic slightly. Not enough, but slightly. She thought about what her father had taught her about asymmetric situations. You don't fight their fight. You make them fight yours. Change the terms. Change the ground. Make them react instead of act. She needed to split them. She moved to the kitchen window above the sink and looked out at the property. She could see 1 flashlight beam near the far fence, moving slowly. The other outside beam was not visible, which meant either behind the house or at the front. She went to the utility room and found what she needed on the bottom shelf. A propane camping lantern, the kind with a manual igniter, the kind her father had kept in their emergency kit for 20 years, and that people kept in Wisconsin retreats because the power went out in Wisconsin retreats. She carried it to the kitchen counter. She found the igniter by feel, the kind that sparked with a push button, and she covered it with her body and pressed it once and got nothing, and pressed it again and got a small pop of flame in the element and turned the valve a fraction. The lantern threw a circle of yellow light. She set it on the kitchen counter where it was visible from the window. Then she crossed back to the utility room, pulled the door most of the way closed, and stood in the dark with the axe handle in both hands, and the cold still in her feet, and her heart doing something fast and deliberate in her chest. The lantern on the counter was a signal. It said, she found a light source. She's in the kitchen. She's trying to find her way around. It said, she doesn't know what she's doing. It said, come inside. 50 seconds. The service door opened. She heard him enter. The careful step, the pause, the way his breathing changed when he saw the lantern light from the kitchen doorway. He came through the kitchen toward the light. She heard him stop at the counter. She heard him pick up the lantern and turn it, examining it. Got a light on in the kitchen, he said quietly. Earpiece communication, which told her they had radio contact, which meant the other 2 would converge on this location within 2 minutes. She came out of the utility room. She didn't announce herself. She didn't hesitate. Her father had been very clear about this. The moment between the decision and the action is where people die. Close it to 0. She swung the axe handle at his forearm, the arm holding the lantern, and connected hard enough that the lantern went one way, and the man's arm buckled and he made a sound that was not quite a word and dropped to one knee. He was bigger than she expected. She'd estimated from his footsteps, and she'd estimated wrong. He was well over 6 feet, and he had the build of someone who worked at it. And even on one knee with a damaged forearm, he was dangerous in a way that the next 3 seconds were going to determine. She swung again, lower, at the back of his knee on the planted leg, and he went down. She did not hit him a 3rd time. She grabbed the weapon that had fallen with him, a compact handgun, which she identified by feel and not by sight, because the lantern was on the floor throwing shadows. And she took 4 steps back into the utility room doorway and pointed it at the shape on the kitchen floor and said, in a voice she barely recognized as hers, "Don't." He was breathing hard, controlled breathing, a man managing pain, not panicking. "You're not going to shoot me," he said. "I don't want to," she said. "That's not the same as won't." A pause. "Fair point," he said, and his voice had something in it that she'd categorize later in a different context as something like professional respect. "Hands on the floor," she said. "Both of them, flat." He put his hands on the floor. "The other 2, she said. "Where?" "One's at the front of the house, one's at the fence line." "Are they coming in?" "Not yet. Depends what I say on the radio. Then you're going to say something useful, she said. Get up slowly. His name, she learned in the next 4 minutes, was not something he was going to tell her, and she didn't push it. What she needed from him was more specific than his name. She walked him at gunpoint to the utility room and used the bungee cords from the bottom shelf. Her father had once told her that bungee cords were underrated as restraints, and she had thought he was being paranoid at the time. And she secured his wrists to the metal shelving unit and left him there with the lantern on the floor 2 feet away so he could see without being able to do much about what he was seeing. The man who organized this, she said. Ricci. I don't know who hired us, he said. Flat. Professional. I know you don't, she said. I'm not asking about that. She crouched to his eye level. Her feet were still numb and her hands were not completely steady, and she was aware that she looked nothing like the thing she was trying to project, and she did it anyway. The financial routing, the payment structure. You were paid through an intermediary. I need to know the account origin. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read in the lantern light. I'm a contractor. They don't give me the financial structure. Who contacted you first? A pause. A man named Sutter. Middleman. Sutter have a first name? Warren. She stood up. She filed Warren Sutter in the part of her mind that kept things intact under pressure, the part her father had developed in her through years of training and that she had never fully understood the purpose of until approximately 90 minutes ago. She went back to the kitchen. The gun was a compact 9mm, 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 chambered. She checked it the way her father had showed her. Confirmed the safety position, confirmed the round count, settled it in her right hand in the grip that was muscle memory from 1,000 dry fire sessions in their small apartment living room with the furniture pushed back. She needed to get to the front of the house before the man at the front decided the radio silence was a problem. She went through the kitchen and into the main hall and moved toward the front with her back to the wall, the gun down at her side, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. The cold had stopped being uncomfortable and started being something she was moving past, which she knew was a warning sign, and filed it as something to deal with later. The front hallway was long, terminating at the main entrance. She could see the faint suggestion of exterior light through the side windows flanking the door. The security lighting running on battery backup, low level, enough to see shapes in the drive. She stopped at the corner where the hallway met the sitting room and looked through the sitting room's front window. The man outside was standing at the bottom of the front steps with his back to the door, watching the driveway. He had a longer weapon, a rifle or a shotgun. She couldn't resolve the shape clearly enough to distinguish. He was talking on his radio. She heard him say, "Carlos, what's your position?" Carlos. The man in the utility room. She moved fast, back down the hall and into the kitchen and to the utility room doorway before the outside man decided to come in and check. "Radio," she said to the man on the floor. He looked at her. "Your radio. Where is it?" Left jacket pocket. She reached in and pulled it out. A compact tactical unit, push-to-talk, the kind that worked on a closed frequency. The outside man was talking through a matching unit. She pushed the button. She said, "Backside of the house. She's in the trees, east slope." A pause. Then the outside man's voice. "Copy. Going around." She heard his footsteps on the front gravel, moving fast, going left around the building toward the east. She went out the front door. The cold hit her face like a flat hand, and she went down the front steps fast and put the house at her back and crossed the driveway at an angle that kept her out of the line of sight from the east side and moved toward the tree line along the access road. Her feet hit gravel and she felt it in every nerve ending and kept moving. The third man was still at the fence line. She could see his flashlight moving 150 meters away along the perimeter. He hadn't heard or seen anything yet. The second man was around the east side of the building, following a decoy, and she had maybe 90 seconds before he found nothing and came back. She was 30 meters from the gate. The gate was electronic but had a manual release. She'd noted the mechanism on arrival, the kind of municipal engineering habit that meant she automatically cataloged entry and exit points. The manual release was a handle on the left post, behind a small panel. She ran. Gravel and frozen grass under her bare feet, and cold air that hit her lungs like metal, and she ran. And at the gate she found the panel and the handle and pulled it, and the gate swung open on a manual release that hadn't been used in months, and was stiff with rust, and she pulled harder and it gave. She went through. The access road was a pale line through the dark forest, 3 miles of gravel and ruts between her and the county road. 3 miles barefoot and below freezing temperature. She started walking. Not running. Running was for short distances. And this was not a short distance, and she needed to manage her heat and her feet with the precision of someone who understood that the cold was now the primary threat, not the men in the house. The men in the house had lost their coordination and their element of surprise, and while that didn't make them not dangerous, it made them reactive rather than proactive, and reactive men were slower men. She walked fast. She walked in the center of the road where the gravel was finest and the frost was thinnest and the ground was marginally less punishing. She held the gun in her right hand inside her jacket pocket, and she breathed through her nose to hold heat, and she counted her steps the way her father had taught her to count distance. At the 800-meter mark, she heard a vehicle on the access road behind her. Coming fast, headlights off. She went into the trees. The vehicle passed, a black SUV, the kind that had been parked in the drive, moving at speed toward the county road. She watched it go. 2 men visible in the front, which meant the third was either still on the property or in the back seat, and she couldn't see him. They were retreating, which meant they'd made a calculation. The job had gone wrong. The element of surprise was gone. Continuing was no longer worth the exposure. She waited 2 minutes to be certain. Then she came back to the road. She was at the 1,700-meter mark when she saw headlights coming from the county road end, moving toward her, moving fast. She held her ground in the center of the road with the gun behind her back, and she watched the lights come, and she thought, if it's them coming back, they'll see me at 50 meters, and I'll have the headlights in my eyes, and they'll have every advantage. She thought, if it's Damien. The vehicle stopped 20 meters away. The headlights stayed on, blinding her. A door opened. Footsteps on gravel. A shape coming toward her out of the light. Lillian. Damien's voice. She did not move for 2 full seconds. She stood in the road in her bare feet with the gun behind her back and the cold in her blood, and she just breathed. Just let the sound of his voice confirm itself and settle. Then she said, 3 men. I have 1 secured in the utility room, 2 left in an SUV heading your direction. Black, no plates visible, maybe 5 minutes ahead of you. He was close enough now that she could see his face in the edge of the headlights. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled calm, not the measured assessment. Something rawer than that. Something that had been afraid and was now reorganizing itself around the fact that she was standing upright in the middle of the road talking about tactical dispositions. Are you hurt? He said. My feet, she said. That's all. He looked down. In the headlight edge, she could see him take in the bare feet on the frozen gravel, and something moved through his jaw. Get in the car. The man in the utility room. His name is Carlos. He mentioned a middleman named Warren Sutter. That's a financial thread. Get in the car, Lillian. I'm telling you because you'll need it before. I know. He took her arm and she let him because her feet had stopped sending useful signals, and the cold was no longer something she was moving past, but something that was moving through her. And the adrenaline that had been holding everything together was doing what adrenaline eventually did. I know. Come on. She got in the car. The heat from the vents hit her like a wall, and she sat in the passenger seat and felt her hands start to shake, which was not fear. She identified it accurately, as her father had taught her, but the physical consequence of sustained extreme cold and sustained elevated cortisol finally being given permission to resolve. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. Vincent was driving. He didn't say anything, which she appreciated. Damien got in the back seat beside her and took her feet in his hands without asking, which was a practical assessment of the cold injury risk, not a gesture, and she let him, and she stared at the roof of the car and thought about Warren Sutter and shell accounts, and what she knew about how financial networks were structured, and how you followed money across jurisdictions when the people moving it were trying hard to make it unfollowable. The SUV, Damien said to Vincent. Tommy has the road, Vincent said. They won't make the highway. Carlos, Damien said. Still in the house, Vincent said. Get him out before the local police pick up the signal disruption. I want him processed before he lawyers up. Already moving. Damien looked at Lillian. Warren Sutter, he said. You're certain of the name. He said it once. I'm certain. He nodded. He held her feet in his hands, and she felt the warmth beginning to register as pain, which was actually a good sign, and she kept breathing. Outside the car. The Wisconsin forest moved past at speed, and behind them, the house with its dead security system and its one restrained operative was getting smaller. She thought about the moment she'd come out of the utility room doorway with the axe handle, and the decision she'd made in the space between the decision and the action, and she thought about what it felt like to be the thing that nobody had prepared for, and she thought about Elena's face saying, "You're not Margaret." She was not Margaret. She was not the woman this world had expected or planned for or known how to categorize. She was something else, and that something else had just survived a thing that was supposed to end differently, and she was sitting in the back seat of a car in Wisconsin with her feet in her husband's hands and the gun still in her jacket pocket because she had not yet found a moment to put it down. "Ricci is going to know it failed by morning," she said. "Yes. He'll move on you directly. He can't leave this half finished. I know." "Then we need the financial structure tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow, tonight. Because if we move on him first before he regroups, we control the terms. If we wait, we don't wait," Damien said. She looked at him. "We don't wait," he said again. "But you're going to let me drive for 20 minutes before we get to the next part." She looked at her hands on her thighs. The shaking was still there, finer now, more internal. 20 minutes, she said. "Yes." She turned to the window. The pines moved past. The sky to the east was not yet light, but had the particular quality of darkness that preceded light, a thinning at the edges rather than solid black all the way through. Somewhere ahead of them, Warren Sutter was a name connected to a money trail connected to a man named Ricci, who had sent 3 professionals to a stone house in Wisconsin, and who was, right now, waiting for a phone call that was never going to come from the people he'd sent to make it. She thought about what her father had told her once about the moment after a fight. Not the immediate aftermath, but the moment when you understood what you'd actually done and what it meant about what you were capable of. "That's when you find out what you're made of," he'd said. "Not during, after. During, you just move. After is when you decide who you are." She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and felt the heat from the car vents reach her feet, and the pain from the cold begin to pulse steadily through her soles, and she decided. She was the woman who had walked 3 miles barefoot in the dark with a gun she'd taken off a man she'd put on the floor, and she was going to take that woman into the next room, and the room after that, and she was going to find every dollar that Ricci thought he'd hidden, and she was going to pull the thread until the whole structure came apart in her hands. And she was not going to stop until every man in Chicago who had ever looked at Damien Moretti's choice and seen a liability understood exactly what kind of mistake they had made. The car moved through the thinning dark toward the highway, and Lillian Brooks sat in the back seat and began, very quietly and very precisely, to plan. Warren Sutter lived in a beige condominium in Naperville and drove a leased Audi and had a LinkedIn profile that described him as a financial consulting specialist with 17 years of experience in cross-border asset management, which was the kind of language that meant everything and nothing, and was specifically designed to mean nothing to anyone who might ask too many questions. Lillian found him in 40 minutes. She was sitting in the back seat of the car with a wool blanket around her feet that Vincent had produced from the trunk with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who kept wool blankets in car trunks as a matter of professional practice. And she had Damien's laptop open on her knees, and she was working through the name Warren Sutter, the way her father had taught her to work through any intelligence problem, not by searching for the answer directly, but by building the context around it until the answer was the only thing left. She started with public corporate registrations. Illinois Secretary of State database, cross-referenced with Delaware filings, because Delaware was where people put the companies they didn't want found without going offshore. She found 4 LLCs with Sutter as registered agent, all formed within the same 18-month window, all with the same registered address in the loop. A mail forwarding service that cost $40 a month and asked no questions. She cross-referenced the LLCs with the name Fortuna Holdings, which she had been carrying in her memory since the night in the hotel corridor over 5 months ago. 2 of the 4 LLCs had transactional relationships with Fortuna Holdings in their public filing history, small enough to be boring, large enough to be real. "I have the structure," she said. Damien looked over her shoulder at the screen. She walked him through it in the same way she'd told him about Marcus Trent. No editorializing, just what was there. 3 layers of company ownership, each one nominally held by a different registered agent, but 2 of the agents were the same individual under slightly different name variations. W. Sutter and Warren A. Sutter, which was the kind of error that happened when you were building a structure fast and didn't have time to be meticulous. Ricci's money went through Sutter into Fortuna and then into the shell accounts that Marcus Trent was moving before I warned you, she said, which means this structure predates me. It predates the meeting in room 7. It was already running when Trent's name came up. Which means Trent wasn't the origin, Damien said slowly. He was the access point. Someone gave Ricci a way into your financial operations through Trent, and then when I disrupted that thread, Ricci kept the shell structure and redirected it through Nico instead. She looked at him. Nico wasn't Ricci's second option. He was the parallel track. They were always running both. The car was quiet for a moment. Vincent said from the front seat, without turning around, "How long has Nico been running parallel?" "At least 8 months," Lillian said. "Probably longer. The LLC formation date suggests the structure was ready 14 months ago." Damien was looking at the screen with an expression she had learned to read over 5 months of watching his face. The absolute stillness that was not calm but its approximation. The thing he did when the emotion was present and substantial, and he was not going to let it run the room. 14 months. Nico Vasquez had been building an exit strategy for 14 months while sitting at Damien's right hand at every dinner and every meeting and every decision that mattered. "He's still at the house," Vincent said. "Is he?" Rosa called. "He's still there. Elena too. They don't know the operation failed." Damien looked at Lillian. Something passed between them that didn't need words. The simple acknowledgement that the next hour was going to be the most consequential of everything that had come before it, and that they were going to it without sleep and without the kind of preparation that made things clean. "Take us back," Damien said. Lillian folded the laptop closed. She unwrapped the blanket from her feet and looked at the damage. Red and raw, but intact. No frostbite, which was the only thing that mattered in the short term. And she put on the socks Vincent had also produced from the trunk, and the pair of shoes that were too big for her by one size, but were better than nothing. And she put the gun in the glove compartment because she was not going to walk back into that house with a weapon she'd taken off a man she'd assaulted. And she sat up straight and watched the road turn and head back toward the mountains. The sky was beginning to differentiate itself from the land by the time they reached the gate, the blackness separating into a dark gray sky above, and a darker gray earth below with the tree line as the border between them. 4:30 in the morning. The access road was empty. The house was lit on the ground floor. Someone had restored partial power, or found candles, or both. As they came up the drive, Lillian could see light in the kitchen windows and movement behind them, which meant the household was awake and aware that something had gone wrong even if they didn't know the specifics of what. Damien's hand found hers in the dark of the back seat for exactly 3 seconds. Not a gesture of comfort, or not only that, more like the thing people do before something difficult to confirm they're both present. Then he let go and opened the door. They went in through the front. Nico Vasquez was in the main sitting room when they came through the door, standing near the fireplace with a glass of something amber in his hand and the studied composure of a man who had been preparing his expression for the last hour. He looked at Damien and said, "There you are. We heard something happened. The power." And then Tommy called and said, He stopped. His eyes went to Lillian, to her feet, to the 2 big shoes, to whatever her face was doing. "Is she all right?" "She's fine," Damien said. "What happened?" "Come sit down, Nico." Something moved through Nico's face. A recalibration. The composure adjusted slightly. Not breaking, but shifting its weight, the way a structure shifts when the load on it changes. "Damien, sit down." Nico sat. He held the glass in both hands, and he looked at Damien with an expression that Lillian catalogued carefully, because it was an important expression and she wanted to understand it accurately. It was not guilt, exactly. Guilt implied surprise at itself. What was on Nico Vasquez's face was something more like the expression of a man who had been waiting for a door to open and was now watching it open and was, underneath all the preparation, still somehow not entirely ready. Elena was in the doorway. She looked from Damien to Nico to Lillian, and her face did something complicated and uncontrolled for the first time since Lillian had known her. The face of a woman understanding something she had been not understanding very hard for a long time. Damien sat across from Nico. He put nothing between them. No table, no distance, just 2 men in chairs with the fire between them and the truth that was about to be spoken aloud sitting in the room like a physical object. 14 months, Damien said. Nico's jaw moved. He didn't say anything. Warren Sutter, Fortuna Holdings, the Ricci parallel track. Damien's voice was completely flat. Not cold, flat, which was different, which was the sound of a man operating in a register beyond temperature. 14 months, Nico. A long silence. The fire made sounds. Outside, the pre-dawn forest was absolutely still. It wasn't, Nico started, and then stopped himself, and Lillian watched him make a decision about what kind of man he was going to be in this moment. He looked at Damien directly. The Lakeshore expansion. You were going to lose the North Shore piece to DeLuca, and you didn't see it. I brought it to you 4 times, and you didn't move. So you decided to move without me. I decided to protect what we built. His voice had something in it now. Not defiance exactly, but the conviction of someone who had told themselves a particular story so many times it had become indistinguishable from belief. Ricci offered structural protection for the North Shore accounts, a parallel arrangement that kept everything intact while I what? Nico stopped. Say it, Damien said. A pause. While you were distracted. His eyes went briefly, involuntarily, to Lillian. The room absorbed that. You told Ricci I was distracted, Damien said. By my wife. By the situation. By the change in your... By my wife, Nico. Say what you mean. Nico set down the glass. His hands were not steady. For the first time since she'd met him, Lillian saw the performance come all the way down. The warmth, the ease, the fishing trip stories. And what was underneath it was a tired man in his 50s who had spent 2 decades in rooms like this one and had made a calculation that seemed, Lillian suspected, perfectly reasonable to him in the moment he made it and had been slowly becoming less reasonable ever since. I didn't know they'd send people here, he said. That wasn't the arrangement. What was the arrangement? Financial separation, clean division of the North Shore accounts. No violence. He pressed his hands flat on his knees. Ricci changed the terms without telling me. He sent 3 men to kill my wife, Nico. The word kill in the room like a dropped weight. Elena made a sound in the doorway, small and involuntary. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and Lillian watched her absorb the full shape of what her husband had built over 14 months. And she watched Elena's face go through something that was not an expression so much as a series of expressions collapsing into each other. I didn't know, Nico said, and his voice had lost its construction. What was left was just a man's voice, unshored. Damien, I did not know that was what he was going to do. But you gave him the location, Damien said, the schedule, the access road layout, the security system protocol. Nico didn't answer. The silence was its own answer. Damien looked at him for a long time. Lillian watched Damien's face during that look, and she saw something she had not seen there before. Not in the hotel suite, not in the kitchen, not in the car. The face of a man looking at someone he had loved in the particular way that men like him loved the people they had worked beside for 2 decades, and understanding that the person he was looking at had been someone else for 14 months, at least, and perhaps longer, and that the grief of that was real and was not going to make any difference to what happened next. Tommy, Damien said. Tommy Chen appeared in the other doorway. Lillian hadn't seen him come in. He was simply there, which was how he always was, and he had 2 men with him whose names she didn't know. Nico looked at Damien one more time. His mouth opened and then closed. There was nothing left to say that the room didn't already know, and he seemed to understand that, and he stood without being told, and he went with Tommy's men without being asked, and the only sound was his footsteps on the stone floor going toward the back of the house. Elena stood in the doorway, and she was very still, and her hand was no longer over her mouth. It was at her side, fingers pressed flat against her thigh, and she was looking at the empty chair where her husband had been sitting. Lillian crossed the room and stood beside her. She didn't touch her. She just stood there, which was the only thing available and the only thing Elena would have accepted. After a long time, Elena said, "How long did you know?" "Since Thursday," Lillian said, when Damien confirmed the financial thread. "And you came anyway? To the retreat?" "Yes." Elena turned to look at her. Her eyes were dry, which Lillian understood. Elena was not a woman who cried in rooms where other people could see it, and that was not coldness. That was just who she was. "You came knowing what might happen." "I came knowing something might happen," Lillian said. "I didn't know the specifics." But you walked the perimeter, Elena said. Yesterday afternoon, I watched you from the upstairs window. I thought you were just restless. A pause. You were preparing. I learned it from my father, Lillian said. You prepare for what might happen so that if it does, you're not starting from nothing. Elena looked at her for a long moment with an expression that Lillian couldn't fully name, something that was grief and reassessment and the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been wrong about something important and knew it completely. I brought you that document, she said. I sat across from you at 6 dinners and I tried to make you feel like you didn't belong here. I know. I was wrong. I know that too. Elena turned back to the empty chair. What happens now to Nico? That's not my decision, Lillian said. But you have influence. Lillian was quiet for a moment. He didn't know about the men they sent here. That matters. She paused. What happens to people who cooperate with the process? That's Damien's call. But the distinction between what Nico knew and what Ricci did without telling him, that distinction exists. Elena absorbed that. It wasn't comfort, and Lillian hadn't offered it as comfort. It was information, which was what Elena actually needed. Go get some sleep, Lillian said. There's nothing more to do tonight. Elena looked at her one last time, a long, direct look that had none of the management in it from the 6 dinners, just a woman seeing another woman clearly. And then she left the room. Ricci's name was Sal Ricci, and he was 63 years old, and he ran his organization from a legitimate front, a real estate development company in the South Loop, with the particular arrogance of a man who had operated without serious consequence for long enough that he had stopped being careful. He had a breakfast meeting on Monday mornings. Same restaurant, same table, same order, eggs Benedict and black coffee, for 11 years. The kind of routine that was either confidence or carelessness, and in Lillian's assessment was both. She spent Sunday putting the financial documentation in order. She worked at the kitchen table in the Lincoln Park house for 9 hours, while Damien's people managed the operational pieces, the Wisconsin situation, the SUV that Tommy's men had intercepted at the county road, the very specific conversation being had with a man named Carlos in a room she hadn't been invited into and didn't need to be. She worked with the laptop and the LLC registrations and the Fortuna Holdings transaction history and everything that Warren Sutter's carelessly duplicated name had opened up. And she built a document that was thorough in the way that only a person with genuine patience could build, because thoroughness was not glamorous and it was not fast, and it required the willingness to follow things that seemed like dead ends all the way to the actual end before concluding they were dead. 3 of the dead ends weren't dead. They were the most important threads in the structure. By 8 in the evening, she had 47 pages of documented financial movement, annotated, cross-referenced, with every LLC and every shell account and every transaction amount and date laid out in a sequence that was, she was confident, clear enough that a person without specialized financial knowledge could follow it from one end to the other and understand exactly where Ricci's money had come from, where it had gone, and what it had been used to build. She printed it twice. Damien looked at it over her shoulder for a long time. "This is enough," he said. "It's more than enough," she said. "It's the whole picture." "Where did you learn to do this?" She thought about it honestly. "My father taught me to follow things. Not finances specifically, just the principle. You don't stop at the surface of something. You go all the way through." He was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like someone I'd like to meet." "He's in Evanston," she said, "watching cable news and eating cereal for dinner because he won't let me stock his kitchen properly." A pause. "You can meet him whenever you want." Something shifted in Damien's face, the thing she'd seen occasionally, the fractional opening. "After Monday," he said. "After Monday," she agreed. The meeting was called for Monday at noon. Damien's territory, Damien's location, the private room on the 43rd floor of the Meridian Hotel, because he had a particular sense of proportion that she was beginning to understand and appreciate. Lillian dressed herself. She did not call Elena's person or accept anyone's help. She wore a dark jacket she'd bought 2 weeks ago that fit her correctly and shoes that belonged to her, and she looked in the mirror in the Lincoln Park house and looked at her own face and thought about the woman who had stood in a service corridor 5 months ago with a wet towel and a broken carafe. And she thought the only honest thing, which was that she would not have predicted this for herself, and that unpredicted things were not by definition wrong. The heads of 4 Chicago families were at the table when she and Damien arrived. She recognized all of them. DeLuca, who was 60 and cautious. Martinelli, who was 55 and smart in the specific way of people who had survived by never being first to move. Benedetti, Carla's husband, whose face showed the particular strain of a man who had heard part of the story and was bracing for the rest. And at the far end of the table, Sal Ricci, who was 63 and who looked at Damien when he came in with an expression of careful pleasantness and looked at Lillian with an expression of something he managed to suppress almost entirely before it registered. Almost. She sat beside Damien. She put the 47 pages on the table in front of her, face down, and she folded her hands on top of them, and she waited. Damien opened the meeting without preamble. He laid out the operational facts: the Wisconsin retreat, the 3 contractors, the failed attempt, in the precise, unemotional language he used for things that were serious, which made them land with more weight than any elevated tone would have. The table was very quiet. Ricci said, when Damien finished, "That's a significant accusation." "It's not an accusation," Damien said. "It's a description of what happened." "You have proof." Lillian turned over the 47 pages and pushed them to the center of the table. Ricci looked at the pages. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that was more complicated than she'd expected. Not just calculation, but the particular quality of a man recalibrating around an element he had categorically failed to account for. "My wife put that together," Damien said. "You have time to look at it." The room looked at the pages. DeLuca reached for them first. He was a careful man, and he read carefully, and his expression as he read told Lillian that the document was doing what it was supposed to do. It was clear enough to follow and specific enough to be undeniable. Ricci did not reach for the pages. He watched DeLuca read, and he held his expression together with the effort of a man who had held expressions together in rooms like this for 30 years, and knew it was the most important skill available to him in this moment. "The Fortuna Holdings structure," DeLuca said, looking up. "This goes back 14 months. "Yes," Lillian said. DeLuca looked at her. It was the first time she'd spoken in the room, and the directness of the look acknowledged it. "You built this from the LLC registrations?" "From the registrations and the transaction history. History and a name provided by one of the contractors sent to Wisconsin." She paused. "Warren Sutter. He's a registered agent in Naperville. He duplicated a name variation across 2 filing jurisdictions, which is how the structure became traceable." Martinelli had the pages now. He flipped to the back, to the transaction summary, and she watched his face. "This connects to the DeLuca North Shore accounts," he said. DeLuca stiffened. "Yes," Lillian said. Ricci's structure was designed to destabilize the North Shore arrangement between Moretti and DeLuca. The money from Nico Vasquez's accounts was going to fund a DeLuca proxy operation that would have made it look like DeLuca was moving against Moretti directly. She looked at DeLuca. "You would have been blamed for a conflict you didn't start." The table was very still. DeLuca put the pages down. He looked at Ricci with an expression that had no management in it at all. Ricci said, "This is fabricated." "By a waitress," Damien said. His voice was completely even. "My wife fabricated 47 pages of documented financial movement using publicly accessible corporate registrations and a name she extracted from a professional contractor in a Wisconsin utility room at 3 in the morning. A pause. "In her socks." The silence in the room was a different quality than before. Lillian watched 4 men process what they were holding in their hands and what they'd just been told, and she watched the weight of it land in each of them differently. DeLuca with cold fury. Martinelli with the particular calculation of a man adjusting his understanding of the landscape. Benedetti with something that looked like relief at having been on the right side of the room before the room shifted. Ricci reached for the inside of his jacket. Damien shot him. The sound was enormous in the stone room, and then the room was moving. Damien's men at the door were inside before the echo finished, and the 4 family heads were out of their chairs, and Ricci was on the floor with his hand still inside his jacket, and the weapon he'd reached for was there, and everyone in the room could see it, and the sequence of events was not ambiguous to anyone present. Lillian had not moved. She was sitting in her chair with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and her 47 pages were at the center of the table still, and she was looking at the space where Ricci had been sitting, and she was breathing. Her father had taught her about this moment too. Not the specifics, not this room, not these people, but this moment, the moment after a thing that cannot be taken back, when everything that was in motion stops and the room rearranges itself around what has just become true. "Don't look away," he'd said. "You were in the room. Own the room." She didn't look away. DeLuca was the first one to speak. He looked at Damien, and then he looked at Lillian, and he said, "The North Shore accounts are intact," Damien said. "The proxy operation never completed." DeLuca looked at Lillian for a long moment, the look of a man recalibrating around a variable he had not known existed. "Your wife built this," he said. "Yes." "In one night." "In 9 hours," Lillian said. "I had the source material. It was just a matter of following it through." DeLuca was quiet. Then he did something she didn't expect. He nodded at her, not a social nod, a specific, deliberate acknowledgement, one professional to another. The kind of nod that meant, "I see what you did and I understand what it took." She nodded back. Martinelli picked up his copy of the 47 pages and straightened them against the table and said, "I'll need a copy of this for my own records." "It's yours," Lillian said. The rest of it moved the way these things moved, in the language and the structures of a world she was still learning, but was learning faster than anyone had expected, including herself. Ricci's organization, without its financial architecture, was a body without a skeleton. It held its shape for about 72 hours before the internal pressure of men discovering that the money they'd been promised was in accounts that had been documented and effectively frozen caused it to dissolve from the inside outward. This was not the kind of collapse that happened dramatically. It happened the way financial things happened, in account statements and missed payments and phone calls that didn't get returned. Warren Sutter cooperated fully when Tommy's people sat down with him, which she'd expected. Warren Sutter was the kind of man who built structures for other people's risks and had no personal investment in anything except his continued ability to do so somewhere else. Nico Vasquez was handled in the way that things were handled in this world, which meant that Lillian was not given the specifics and did not ask for them. What she knew was that he was no longer a presence and that Elena, 3 weeks later, left Chicago for a house she'd had in her name for 20 years in coastal Maine, and that before she left she called Lillian on the phone. "I'm going," Elena said. "I heard. I want you to know—" She stopped, started again. "I want you to know that I understand now. What Damien saw. Why he chose you." A pause. "I didn't understand it before. I thought it was sentiment. A disruption. I was wrong." "You were protecting something that mattered to you," Lillian said. "I was wrong about what needed protecting," Elena said. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Lillian sat with the phone in her hand for a moment and thought about Margaret Moretti, who had been born to this world and had been the right person for it in every way anyone had ever measured, and she thought that being compared to a ghost was one of the loneliest things in the world, and that Elena had been living with that comparison pressing on both sides, Margaret's absence on one side, Lillian's presence on the other, and that the weight of that was something she could understand even if she couldn't fix it. She put the phone down and went to make dinner. Her father came to the Lincoln Park house for the first time on a Saturday in December, 3 weeks after Wisconsin. He came in a car that Damien had sent for him, which he had neither refused nor commented on, because he was not a man who refused practical assistance or performed emotions about it. He was 64 and he moved like a man who had once moved differently and remembered it in his body. The ghost of military bearing still in his shoulders, the slight hitch in his right knee from an injury that had never fully healed. He came through the front door with his coat on and his eyes doing the thing they always did in a new space, the same thing Lillian's eyes did, the cataloging. He looked at the entrance hall. He looked at the stairs. He looked at Damien, who had come to the door himself to meet him, which was something Lillian had noticed and not commented on. The two men looked at each other for a moment. "Mr. Brooks," Damien said. "Frank," her father said. They shook hands. Her father's eyes did a thing during the handshake that she recognized. The assessment, the thing he used to do with every person she'd ever introduced him to. The reading of what a person was made of through the limited information available in a first meeting. She had never fully explained to him what had happened in Wisconsin. She'd told him the essential facts without the texture of them, because her father understood essential facts and did not require texture to form accurate conclusions. She watched him finish his assessment of Damien, and she watched his face settle into something that was not approval exactly. Her father was not a man who handed out approval, but acceptance. The recognition of a quality he'd been looking for and had found. They ate dinner. Her father and Damien talked for 3 hours, and the conversation was, on the surface, about practical things: Chicago, the lake, the neighborhood, the house's history. And underneath that surface was a different conversation that didn't require words. The conversation that two people have when they are both trying to determine if the person across the table is worthy of something that matters to them. Lillian ate her dinner and listened and let it happen. After dinner, her father found her in the kitchen where she was doing what she always did when she needed to think. Something with her hands, the plates, the counter. And he stood beside her in the easy silence that was their oldest communication, the one that predated language between them. "He's careful with you," her father said finally. "Yes. Careful in the right way. Not the way that means he's protecting you from things." He paused. "The way that means he's paying attention." "Yes," she said again. Her father was quiet for a moment. "Wisconsin," he said. "Yeah. You did what I taught you." "I did what you taught me." He was quiet for another moment, the kind of quiet that her father made when he was managing something internal. She didn't push it. She had never pushed her father, and he had never pushed her, and they had understood each other better for it. "Your mother would have been—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together and looked at the counter and then at her. "She would have had a lot of opinions," he said, "about all of this." "She always did," Lillian said. Her father almost smiled. It was the closest he got, usually. The almost. "She would have liked him," he said. "She would have argued with him constantly, and she would have liked him." "I know," Lillian said. He stayed until 10. Damien drove him back himself, which her father also neither refused nor commented on, and which told her something about both of them that she didn't need translated. The Children's Hospital Gala was in February. Lillian wore something she'd chosen herself. Dark blue, well cut, nothing borrowed, and nothing suggested. And she stood beside Damien in the receiving line, and she shook hands with people who had, 3 months ago, been part of a world that had looked at her and seen a waitress from the north side with no business being in the rooms she was in. The rooms were the same. The people in them were the same. She was not exactly the same. Carla Benedetti was there, and she touched her tennis bracelet and said, "You look wonderful." And Lillian said, "Thank you, Carla," and meant it without subtext, because she had no subtext left for Carla Benedetti, and it occurred to her that this was its own kind of arrival. The ability to be in a room with someone who had underestimated you and feel nothing about it beyond the mild warmth of someone who has stopped keeping score because the score no longer matters. DeLuca was there, and he crossed the room to her specifically, not to Damien, to her. And he said, "The North Shore arrangement. My people want to speak with you directly about the financial documentation protocols going forward." "I'm available," she said. "Good." He looked at her with the straightforward assessment that she'd come to understand was his highest register of respect. No performance, just the direct evaluation of someone he considered worth evaluating directly. "Damien's lucky," he said. "We both are," she said. He nodded and moved on. She found Damien an hour into the evening, standing near the windows that looked out over the frozen lake, the city lights reflected in the ice. Chicago doing what Chicago did in February, asserting itself against the cold with the particular stubbornness of a place that had been doing it long enough to be good at it. She stood beside him and looked at the lake. "DeLuca's people want to meet," she said. "I heard." "About the financial documentation protocols." "I heard that too." A pause. "You don't have to take that on." "I know I don't have to," she said. He looked at her. "But?" She thought about the 47 pages. She thought about 9 hours at the kitchen table, following a thread that most people would have found tedious beyond endurance, and finding at the end of it something that mattered, something that changed what happened in a room full of men who had been waiting to see which way the weight came down. She thought about what her father had built into her over 15 years in a small apartment with topographic maps and dry fire sessions, and the patient, serious instruction of a man who believed that preparation was the most honest form of love. "I'm good at it," she said simply. Damien looked at the lake for a moment. Then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was the open one, the fraction that became something larger, the thing she'd seen rarely and valued because of it. Yes, he said. You are. She looked at the frozen lake and the city lights beyond it, and she thought about a service corridor and a broken carafe and a door that had opened on purpose, and all the things that had been set in motion by a woman who couldn't have known she was being used and had made the decision to go upstairs anyway. Not because she knew what would happen, but because she knew what happened when you didn't. She was not the woman they'd planned for. She was not the woman they'd expected or underestimated or tried to remove from the board on a frozen night in Wisconsin. She was not Margaret Moretti, or the idea of her, or the shadow of anyone. She was Lillian Brooks, who had been a waitress, and who was now something that the world she'd walked into did not have a clean word for. Not a mob wife in the way the category was understood. Not a civilian, not an operator, but something built from all three, and from her father's voice in her head, and from 9 hours at a kitchen table, and from 30 meters into a pine forest in bare feet with the cold in her blood and the decision already made. She was Damian Moretti's wife. She was the woman who had walked back into a house full of people who wanted her dead and come out the other side with a name and a thread and 47 pages that had ended a man's empire more thoroughly than any gun would have. She was, she thought, exactly who she had always been. The world had just taken a while to find out. She picked up her glass. Damian picked up his. They didn't toast. They were not people who toasted things, neither of them. It wasn't their language. They just touched the glasses once, lightly, and looked at the lake, and the city held its lights against the dark, the way it always had and always would, indifferent and magnificent and entirely itself. And Lillian Brooks stood inside it, and was entirely herself, and that was enough. That had always been enough.